Good evening, everyone. We will begin shortly. We are waiting for a few more people to join the webinar. As this is a webinar, cameras and microphones are not required. I would like to welcome you to our Leaving Cert Art webinar. The rollout of Leaving Cert Art National Seminar Day 2, which was due to begin in September, has been postponed until early November. A letter and flyer will be sent out shortly advertising the dates for this seminar, which is planned to be delivered face-to-face. However, we continue to be guided by public health information. While we greatly regret being unable to engage face-to-face at present, we are delighted that we are able to meet you online. My name is Kathleen McCormick. I've been seconded to work with the PDST for the last 2 years. I was a teacher in the Teresian School in Dublin, which is an all-girls school. I'm joined here tonight by my colleague, Kieran, who will present some of the webinar. I will hand over to Kieran now and let him introduce himself.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. You're all very welcome this evening to our webinar. My name is Kieran Gallagher. I am originally from Donegal, but like Kathleen, I have been seconded to the PDST for the last 2 years, working on the Leaving Certificate Art specification, and I'm seconded from St. Oliver's Community College in Drogheda.
Thank you, Kieran. Today's webinar will be available on the art page of the PDST website, and you can see the website there on the screen. And that will be available after the 7th of October. If you have any questions after today, please feel free to contact us at seniorcycleart@pdst.ie, or you can follow us on Twitter. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A function. We will take time during and at the end of the webinar to address these questions. How to ask a question in the webinar. If you toggle on your toolbar, you will see that there's a Q&A option. Just click on the Q&A button, and on the toolbar on your screen, another window will open. You can type your question here and press send. To avoid repetition of questions, you can upvote a question that has already been asked if you also want the answer to that question. As I mentioned, we will answer some of the questions live during the webinar, but we will also type some of the answers also. As PDST are facilitators of CPD for teachers, our remit does not extend to states examinations. Therefore, we're not in a position to answer any questions related to the states exam. All such questions should be directed to the SEC. Information relating to assessment for certification can be found on page 19 to 22 of the specification. A question we get asked quite frequently is, what will the written paper look like? Until the sample papers are released, we won't know what the exact format will look like. The specification does mention that, and I'm quoting directly from the spec from page 21, the written examination will have a range and balance of question types suited to visual studies and the application of practical knowledge. The questions will focus on a broad understanding of visual studies and will require learners to demonstrate knowledge and understanding and ability to apply, analyse, and evaluate and respond as appropriate. We would ask that you not use the raised hand function as it is not in operation tonight, and we will use the chat function from time to time to pop in some links and to ask for your input on various sides. Please don't use the chat function for questions because they can actually get lost in the reams of chat. Let us take an overview of what tonight's webinar contains. We will start with a brief recap on National Seminar Day 1, looking at the key skills, the strands and the strand units and learning outcomes. We'll then take some time to explore visual studies, the framework, elements, content areas. We will examine content area 3 and its 4 sections of focus in greater detail. Afterwards, we will consider planning for teaching and learning. And finally, we will take time to address those questions. Let us recap on some of the information covered in National Seminar Day 1, where we discovered the Leaving Certificate Art specification is presented in 3 strands: create, research, and respond, and that the key skills are embedded in the learning outcomes associated with the strands, giving students the opportunity to encounter them in an integrated way. The three strands, create, research, respond, are interlinked and interdependent and therefore should not be studied in isolation. Each of these strands are divided into strand units. Create is divided into the strand units of making, contextual inquiry, process, realization, and presentation. The research strand is divided into the strand units of looking, recording, and documenting, experimenting, interpreting, contextual inquiry, and process. And the respond strand is divided into the strand units of analysis, contextual inquiries, impact and value, critical and personal reflection, and process. Remember that these strand units are numbered, but it is not to reflect a hierarchy of purpose. It's just for ease of identification. When planning for teaching and learning, it is important to note that it is possible to begin a piece of work from any one of these strands, and that all three strands are experienced by learners in each scheme of work. And that's found on page 15 of the specification. The strand units are further divided into learning outcomes. The learning outcomes are presented on the right-hand column as students should be able to. And on the left-hand column, it is the strand units students learn about. It is important to remember that learning outcomes should be achievable to each learner's ability, and that's taken from the Leaving Cert Art specification, page 13. In May 2020, the NCCA published the visual study information online, and in June of that year, the information was included in an updated version of the specification as Appendix A, Visual Studies. This included the Visual Studies Framework, Visual Studies, Content Area and the Written Component, Visual Studies Content Area 1, 2, and 3. We will be spending most of this evening concentrating on these areas. It is important to remember that the section Advice for Teachers and Students remained online, and you can access that information on the link that's provided in the chat. As you can see, there are 4 sections: Advice for Teachers, Advice for Students Visual Study, the Visual Study Framework and the Practical Work, and the Art Sketchpad. If you use the down arrows and click on that, you will see there's about a page of information under those 4 headings. We would advise that you print off that information and attach it to your art curriculum specification. It is important that you have the most up-to-date version that includes the Visual Studies Appendix. I will now hand you over to Kieran, who will go through the Visual Studies Framework information.
So I'm just going to share my screen with everyone, and I'm going to go through the Visual Studies information. Let's remind ourselves of the definition of visual studies: the study of the visual expressions of all aspects of culture created by past, recent, modern, and contemporary societies is called visual studies. By researching, creating, and responding to work, students will learn to know and understand the work they make, as well as work by other artists. And that definition is taken from the specification on page 13 and page 23. What does it mean for teachers and students? This definition allows for greater scope for the selection of artists and artworks to support students' learning. Visual studies can be embedded in all stages of the student's creative process, from informing their theme to expanding practice through exploration of materials and the artistic process of others. Through their engagement with visual studies, the learner will come to understand how it can enhance and inform their own work. As referenced in Advice for Students Visual Studies, teachers will assist students in selecting examples of art and artists. However, as students progress in their studies and work, it is expected that this level of support around selecting artists and artworks will become more collaborative, or that some of these decisions are taken solely by students. During their time at senior cycle, learners will now experience visual studies in a more integrated way. The learner will become aware of the world of visual studies and how it can inform both their practical and written work. The Visual Studies Framework was developed and sets out to answer 3 main questions that are important to visual studies. What was created, how was it created, and why was it created? The Visual Studies framework supports teachers and students in planning for teaching and learning. And that definition is taken from page 23 of the Leaving Cert Art specification. Now let's take a look at the Visual Studies framework and content areas. So if we have a broad overview, the framework is structured around 6 elements. These elements should be used when the student is engaging with both the practical and the written work. There are 3 main content areas within Visual Studies. All 3 content areas create opportunities for students to explore and engage in a variety of art-led experiences in both their practical and written work. And as always, the student or the learner is placed at the center of the educational experience. We've just looked at the framework, which is structured around 6 elements. These elements should be used to understand what occurred before the period movement, the period or movement being focused on itself, and any effect on the period movement on later ideas or artwork. The 6 elements are context, artist and artwork, analysis, art elements and design principles, media and areas of practice, and innovation and invention. The Visual Studies content areas are 1. Europe and the wider world, 2. Ireland and its place in the wider world, 3. Today's world. We are now going to take a closer look at these content areas. Each content area contains a number of sections of focus. So content area 1, Europe and the wider world. This broadly covers the canon of Western art from the Romanesque and Gothic periods to the present. The sections of focus are Romanesque and Gothic, the Renaissance, Proto-Early, High Renaissance and Mannerism, Baroque, Realism, Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, Modernism and Post-1960. Content Area 2, Ireland and its place in the wider world. This broadly covers a selection of significant periods of art as experienced in Ireland across the centuries. However, it is important that connections to Europe and the wider world are made where relevant. Our sections of focus in Ireland and its place in the wider world are pre-Christian, insular, late medieval architecture and art, Georgian period, Irish art and modernism, and post-1960. And for the written component, the student must choose one section of focus within content area 1 and one section of focus within content area 2. When studying their chosen sections of focus, students should address all 6 elements of the Visual Studies framework. 3. Today's world. This broadly covers critical literacy and contextual inquiries to decode, decipher, and make meaning from a range of art-led experiences that students can study locally, nationally, internationally, or virtually. Students are encouraged to explore, experience, and reflect on art and culture in their everyday lives through 4 sections of focus, which are artist theory and thinking, artist process and media, art as social commentary or commentator, and art in the environment. For the written component, students will study all sections of focus in Content Area 3. And when studying all sections of focus within Content Area 3, students should refer to the 6 elements of the Visual Studies framework where relevant. It should also be noted that Content Area 3, Today's World, should not be seen in isolation, and students need to be made aware that links can be formed with Content Area 1 and 2, Europe and the wider world, and Ireland in its place in the wider world. And that's taken from the Leaving Cert Art specification on page 29. So let's remind ourselves of the Visual Studies framework. The framework is structured around 6 elements: context, artist and artwork, analysis, art elements and design principles, media and areas of practice, innovation and invention. And these elements should be used to understand what occurred before the period movement being focused on, the period movement itself, and any effect of the period movement on later ideas or artworks. The elements are tools that teachers and students can use to study your chosen section of focus. When studying a section of focus, discussions and questions can be built around these elements in your classroom. We're now going to explore how to use the framework elements to study a chosen section of focus. Select a section of focus from either content area 1 or 2 that you may wish to study with your students. Keep your chosen section of focus in mind as we read through and explore and analyze the description of each element. So as we've just said, we'd like you to select one section of focus from either content area 1 or 2 that you may wish to study with your students. We'll give you a minute to look at the sections of focus, select one, keep your chosen section of focus in mind as you read through and analyze the description of each element. And now hand you over to Kathleen, who's going to bring you through those descriptions.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Now we're going to take some time to explore the framework element context. I'd invite you to pause the webinar and take 3 minutes to read the description. Keep in mind the highlighted words we've in blue, and also keep in mind the section of focus that you may be covering with your 5th year students. When studying a section of focus, discussions and questions can be built around this element in your classroom. What would be important to consider under the element of context? For example, if you'd chosen content area 1 and the section of focus, realism, impressionism, and post-impressionism, what happened before that movement, circumstances surrounding the period? What led to the development of realism? What was happening in Paris, in France during the time? The historic, political, social, economic, and ideologically. How did that impact the work and artists of that time? Was Monet and the fellow Impressionists influenced by the Franco-Prussian War? Had the Industrial Revolution an impact on their work? Or possibly the rise of the working class? Were they reflected in subject matter of these artists' work? What role did the patrons and agencies play in promoting art and artists? The Salon de Refusé, Durand Ruel example, his patronage had huge influence on the Impressionists. How did other examples of visual culture that existed around their chosen area influence the artist's work? Take, for example, Impressionists. They might look at influence such as photography, landscape. Definitely Japanese prints influenced their subject matter, but also their composition. Rural and urban design, architecture. This is how the element context could be used to explore and understand the section of focus. We'll move on to the next framework element, artists and artwork. Again, I want you to keep in mind your section of focus when you read the description of the framework element, artist and artwork. Please pause the webinar for 2 minutes. When studying a section of focus, discussions and questions can be built around this element, artist and artworks, in your classroom. What would be important to consider under this element? What actually does it mean most recognized? If we take the section of focus, the Renaissance, Proto-Early, High Renaissance, and Mannerism, who are the most recognized artists from the section of focus that demonstrate the ideas, subjects, style, themes, genre, and techniques of that period movement? We always have to keep in mind from Leaving Cert Art Specification, page 29, the definition of the term artist. It states that the term artist should be taken to include those who created work through fine art, design, and craft in a range of traditions, contemporary, new, and/or digital media. Students should study artists and artworks by viewing the actual work, the site where they are located. If we take the section of focus that we mentioned earlier, the Renaissance, Proto-Early, High Renaissance, and Mannerism, a trip to Italy would be wonderful, but realistically, that mightn't happen for us all. However, there are a number of these artworks found in Irish galleries. Again, let us remind ourselves that the description says where possible. When studying an artist or artwork, a student needs to understand the artist's reason for creating their work and their influences. Their work, for example, maybe influenced by their upbringing or their education. Giotto's upbringing and education, for example, had a huge impact on his work. And Michelangelo's artwork reflected the struggle he had with his beliefs throughout his life. This is possibly how the element artists and artwork could be used to explore and understand the section of focus. Let us move to the next framework element, analysis. Once again, I'm inviting you to pause the webinar and to read the description, keeping in mind your chosen section of focus. When studying a section of focus, discussions and questions can be built around this element in your classroom. What would be important to consider under the element of analysis? When analysing an artwork, students could use the following questions. What is going on in this artwork? And what do I see that supports my observations and descriptions? These questions are very familiar to us if we have been engaging in VTS. If we take the section of focus, Irish Art and Modernism, and look at the well-known artwork, The Liffey Swim by Jack B. Yeats, and address the above questions, students may be asking themselves, what is going on in this artwork? They may respond by saying there are crowds of people looking at something in the water, but what do I see that supports that? The people are all facing into the water and seem to be looking at something. It seems to be in the past. What do I see that supports this observation? Maybe the clothing, maybe the style of the bus. Students should be able to describe and discuss the work they are analysing using appropriate art terminology, including visual and critical language, and be able to communicate and or demonstrate the understanding of such terminology. At junior cycle, students have been developing their visual language and appropriate art terminology. If you've attended any of the JC cluster days, we know that they have been at the forefront of developing students' visual language. As the student progresses through the 2-year at senior cycle, the teacher will support them in developing their critical and visual language further. We know as art teachers, we meet our students at the age and stage that they are at. By considering the element analysis, connections can be made to other elements to understand the section of focus being studied by your student. Let us move on to the next framework element, art elements and design principles. This is one we are more familiar with. And again, I ask you to pause the webinar and read this particular framework element. What would be important to consider under the element art elements and design principle? This element is one we're very familiar with, as I said. The art elements and design principles are the building blocks for any work of art. Students should be able to discuss and explain an artist's use and understanding of the art elements and design principles. If we look at Content Area 2, Ireland and its place in the wider world, and the section of focus Insular, for example, and examine the illustrated manuscripts, what art elements and design principles do we need to consider? Certainly colour, balance, pattern. This is how we can use this particular framework element to consider the section of focus being studied. Let us move on to the next framework element. Again, take some time to pause the video and read the description of the element, media, and areas of practice. What would be important to consider under the element, media, and areas of practice? For example, if we chose Content Area 2 in the section of focus post-1960s and focused on Irish sculpture, students would examine the various media in their processes. They would learn about how to use media and also learn about the potential and limitations of the media in terms of making and the impact their choice of media had on the reading of the artwork. If we take, for example, the exhibition Sculpture in Context that's now in the Botanic Gardens, most of the artists have used media in a variety of very interesting ways. Students could look at the artists and how they have pushed the boundaries of media and the impact created as a result. This is how the element media and area of practice could be used to explore and understand your chosen section of focus. We'll now move on to the last framework element, innovation and invention. Once again, I invite you to pause the webinar to read the description of innovation and invention. When exploring this framework elements, students should learn how the discovery of new materials, media, and tools shape the development of art and how big ideas promoted change and innovation in the world at large. Take, for an example, Romanesque and Gothic. What were the innovations of this period and how did it influence the architecture of the time? We may be learning, or students may be learning, about flying buttresses or ribbed vaults and how they influenced and determined what the architecture looked like in the Romanesque and Gothic period. The visual study framework, which is structured around the 6 elements we have explored, is used to support teachers and students in planning for teaching and learning. We will concentrate on the practical application of these framework elements to sections of focus during National Seminar Day 2 in November. We are aware that we've provided a lot of information in this webinar. If you have any questions following viewing this webinar, please send them to us, seniorcycleart@pdst.ie. I will now hand you over to Kieran, who will bring you through the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Kathleen. In this section of our webinar, we'll explore Content Area 3 and its related sections of focus. The 4 sections of focus in Content Area 3 are Artist, Theory and Thinking, Artist, Processes and Media, Art as Social Commentary or Commentator, and Art and the Environment. All sections of focus in Content Area 3 must be studied, and students should understand that to varying degrees, all 4 sections are interconnected and should be referred to where relevant when studying the other sections. But how might we approach Content Area 3? Today's world aims to foster and nurture the skills of critical literacy and contextual inquiries, to decode, decipher, and make meaning from a range of art-led experiences that students can study locally, nationally, internationally, or virtually. There are many possible approaches to this, including students engaging with art in the public domain, such as visiting local or national galleries and museums, engaging with the built and natural environment, visiting an artist in their studio, or interventions by the art world within the school, such as Artists in the Classroom projects. We will now examine each section of focus and ask you to consider what art-led experiences could be explored with your students. So again, we're going to ask you to pause this recording and take some time to read the description of the section of focus, Artist, Theory and Thinking. So from reading the section of focus, Artist, Theory and Thinking, what art-led experiences might you explore with your students? So you could bring an artist, designer, craftsperson into the classroom, or get involved in arts engagement projects such as Creative Engagement, BLAST, or Creative Schools. Those experiences might not be available to all of us, so what are alternative options? Can we have an online interview with an artist, designer, or craftsperson? If we do some research, we might find some of those interviews already exist online. One of the only benefits of the pandemic is that a number of galleries and artists have taken part in podcasts or video interviews. You could also possibly go to a local or national gallery or museum and check what resources are available there. Books may also have interviews with artists of the past and recent modern artists. And most contemporary artists have social media and may be contactable there. So again, we'll ask you to pause the webinar and read the description of the section of focus, Artists, Processes and Media. So what art-led experiences might you explore with your students? So links can clearly be made between this section of focus and Artist, Theory and Thinking. So similar art-led experiences might be explored. Remember, we are focusing on what processes and media the artists are using. So again, we might go to our books to find interviews of artists from past or recent modern, or look at those videos where we have artists discussing their work, which could be found online. We could view podcasts, or again, we could engage with artists directly where possible. There are many artists available online, including resources on our own website, the JCT resource section, as well as the ATI section. In the recent ATI conference, a number of artists, designers, and craftspeople spoke at length about their theories, their thinking behind their work, as well as the processes and media involved in how they create their work. We'll now pause the webinar to read the description of the section of focus, Artist Social Commentary or Commentator. What art-led experiences might you explore with your students so that they engage with this section of focus? We may look at artists who explore social, cultural, political, and economic ideas or themes within their work. Where is that work located? Is it in the public domain? Is it online? Is the work interactive? Is the work permanent or temporary? You could also consider looking at architects who explore social housing, eco-design, or use sustainable building materials. And these are just a few examples of how you can engage with your students and look at the section of focus, Art, a Social Commentary or Commentator. We'll now look at the last and fourth section of focus. So again, we'll ask you to pause the webinar to read the description of art and the environment. For this section of focus, we'll consider what examples we might think of when artists, designers, and craftspeople use the environment as a primary source for inspiration. We also could look at how artists, designers, and craftspeople use the environment as a medium in its own right. There are many artists who have used the environment as a primary source for inspiration. We can again look at the work of Monet, look at the work of Turner or Tracy Emin. You have contemporary Irish artists who use the environment to create work. You also have artists who use the environment as a medium in their own right. Again, we have the ATI conference where the artist Elaine Harrington discussed how she used the earth as a medium, her research into clay and its possibilities and how it has informed her practice and processes and when she's making work. It is very clear that this section of focus links directly with the previous section of focus, Art, a Social Commentary or Commentator, as suggested in the description. More recent developments have seen environmental artworks that address social and political issues, which can include the use of the environment itself as the medium and/or the message. We have just explored how to approach Content Area 3 and considered how to use all 4 sections of focus to explore art-led experiences. Let's remind ourselves that all sections of focus in Content Area 3 must be studied, and students should understand that to varying degrees, all 4 sections are interconnected and should be referred to where relevant when studying the other sections. During National Seminar Day 2, we'll spend some more time exploring Content Area 3 and its sections of focus. So I'll now hand you over to Kathleen, who's going to bring you through the remaining few slides of our webinar.
Thank you very much, Karen. We're now going to look at what to consider when planning for teaching and learning. You may remember from National Seminar Day 1 this particular slide and the factors we need to consider when planning for teaching and learning. We know we have to have learning outcomes from all 3 strands: create, research, and respond. We have just looked at visual studies and the importance that they are for both the students' written and their practical work. You may have already decided on what area of practice you're going to engage with your students and chosen a stimulus and ensured that they have access to primary sources. You may have considered what sketchpad they will use to record their work. This could be your traditional sketchpad. It also could be a scroll or just simply loose pages. And you've considered differentiation. As our teachers, we're constantly ensuring that the needs of all of our students are met when we are planning schemes of work. Once again, I'd like to remind you, if you have any questions after viewing this webinar, you can send those questions to us at seniorcycleart@pdst.ie. Lastly, it just remains for me to thank you for viewing this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at National Seminar Day 2, which commences in November. I will now hand you over to my colleague, Kieran, who will have the final word.
Thanks very much, Kathleen, and thank you very much for your attention and watching this webinar. We're looking forward to seeing you all very soon for National Seminar Day 2.